good morning to one and all. As we enter into the first session of this international webinar, we have with us a renowned person who is the keynote speaker of this session. It's none other than Dr. Devika. She's a historian, feminist, social critic, and academician from Kerala. She's currently placed as a professor, Center for Development Studies, Trivandrum. When I made a cursory glance of her profile, I was astonished to see the number of publications and the number of fellowships which she has received, and the literary works she has contributed to the Kerala society. On behalf of my Women's Studies Center and on my personal behalf, I welcome you, ma'am. Over to Dr. J. Devika.
I want to thank you all for giving me this opportunity to speak at this important meeting. Yes, in a way, this is something we just cannot take our minds off. You know, it has touched our lives so closely, continues to threaten us, and I mean, there are legitimate fears that, given the fact that we are living in a time of climate change, and the Anthropocene is on us, whether the entire century, that is the 21st century, will be the century of pandemics. And honestly, I feel even guilty, because if you just think about Kerala since the early years of the new millennium, you will see that we have actually been living through several epidemics, starting with the chikungunya epidemic, the bird fever, then the chikungunya, then the leptospirosis. So many of these new communicable diseases have arrived on our shores as epidemics. Of course, Nipah is just barely passed. So in a sense, this is a challenge that we all need to debate, and I really congratulate the Women's Studies Center at the Cochin University for taking up this topic. So in a sense, you know, I completely agree with what was said earlier about the situation of women in the pandemic, not just in Kerala, but everywhere in the world. And much has, appeared in the press about this, and I'm glad for that, because it is indeed heartening to know that the questions of the issues of people who are not always in public, who are not always in the mind of the public. I mean, women have been an object of government, but rarely of care, of public care. But the fact that the question of domestic violence came up for discussion quite early on in the pandemic in India, in Kerala, in the world, the rest of the world, is actually a heartening fact. Now, the pandemic, it presents a very strange situation. I mean, there is every reason to think that the vulnerabilities of the already vulnerable sections of people have increased. Now, the pandemic is in a situation where you have all the structures that contribute to inequality in the world, including gender, inequality, injustice. All these structures stay in place, while the mechanisms for redressing them, the mechanisms for changing society for the better, are somehow suspended, frozen, or slow. So that is a dangerous situation. So you have everything there. You have the injustice, the inequality, all there, while the mechanisms for the redressal are slowed down. Now, this is a fact that was recognized fairly well early on, at least as far as gender is concerned, though I can't say the same for other kinds of inequalities, as we witnessed the terrible scenes of the terrible suffering of India's working poor across the cities, their desperate attempts to get back home. But at least for gender, there was some discussion, there was some talk about domestic violence. of some means of redressing this kind of violence. There was some talk about children. So all that is a little consolation in a time of great despair. Now, as you know, that this is not just a phenomenon in our society. It was actually, in fact, raised in Europe at the height of the pandemic. So government set up alternate channels of communication for women who were affected by domestic violence. Special, remedial packages were offered to such women. And these were emulated in other parts of the world. And I mean, the least was, there were at least some pronouncements, even when these packages or some concrete help was not offered. Some leaders, world leaders, and even our own leaders here offered explicit public support to these women through at least their statements. But while this is a good thing, as I told you, I personally feel that to reduce the issue of women's vulnerability to the question of domestic violence during the pandemic would be actually inadequate. And if overdone, it could be a completely unnecessary concession to gender conservatism. It would be in some ways strengthening implicitly the idea that women essentially are at home, belong to the home, and they need to be protected in the home. So actually women have a range of issues which are not all of domestic violence, which need to be addressed at the time of the pandemic. And I'm hoping that your the deliberations that follow this address will pay attention. In fact, what I want to do in this talk is to raise some issues which might be of interest for your later discussion. I also believe that limiting gender talk in the time of pandemic to women and children, in a way that cuts out trans women and people of other gender identities and sexual orientations might be an unjust reduction of the notion of gender justice. So we are talking about gender justice. We need to, I think, get out of a binary framework. We need to accept the fact that the category women now includes cis women and trans women. So when we talk about women, it's not just about cis women. We also need to think that, understand, as I just said, that all women are not housewives. Some women also actually, in Kerala, for example, nearly 25% of the families in Kerala are female-headed households. So there, in those households, the impact of the pandemic may not be in the form of domestic violence, but it may be, in other ways, which we need to pay attention to. So, however, now I leave that to your thoughts, but let me also share a few thoughts on the dominant discourse on the family during the time of the pandemic in Kerala. We have been seeing, especially on the social media, in other spaces, people sharing thoughts about family life, on what it should be like, what is it to be in a family during the pandemic, and so on. Now, I think there are two important strands in these arguments. The one strand is what we have taken up in this seminar, that domestic violence is a problem, that families need to be worried about increasing violence against women and children. Now, in this is one strand. The other strand, which we encounter very often in social media, is about how family life has improved after the pandemic. Now, because people are forced to stay at home now, they are now devoting more and more time to their children, or more and more time to domestic activities. So men are becoming familiar with kitchens, and it's like some of it is like some conquest narrative, of Columbus reaching, discovering a new land or something like that. It's like that. Some of them, oh, I never knew that kitchen could be such an interesting place and so on. Some men saying things like that. No, but whatever. The idea is that the family life is actually thriving and blossoming in the wake of the pandemic. So in some ways, we have picked up some values and some emotions and relationships which we have neglected in the past, and because of our focus on the public, we have neglected the domestic, and this is now a time to heal the domestic and make the family wonderful, feel good again. So these are the two different strands. Now, these are two distinct, these are, as you might have already noticed, implicit in these two different strands are two distinctly different basic understandings of what the family is like as an institution. In the first strand, we are not romantic about the family. We consider it to be an institution of power, of inequality. We see it as an institution where the unequal distribution of power is skewed against women and children. So therefore, there is the possibility of violence. There's the possibility of all kinds of violations of justice. In the other view, the second view, there is no such distrust of the family. There is a far more hopeful, optimistic portrayal. There is the feeling that what was fundamentally wrong is not the structure. The structure of the family is not fundamentally problematic. What was problematic was the way in which our lives outside the family drew us away from it. So we were disconnected from the family because we simply had no time. Because we were so busy with our careers, because we were so busy with our workplaces, because we were so busy with our friends and our networks, we did not have enough time for the family. That's the second strand. That is the idea of the family. So then there is an optimism here that if you get sufficient time, then you can kind of have a happy family life, and the family is a good institution fundamentally. So these are the two basic ideas of the family that underlie these narratives. Now, if you ask me how a sociologist should approach these narratives, then I would say that you have to approach it in the light of two different knowledges. Now, one is the accumulated knowledge that we have about the Malayali family through our various data collecting mechanisms. The other form of knowledge that you should use to approach these narratives is, of course, the history of the ideal family in Kerala and its unfolding, its actual unfolding in time. So these are the two kinds of knowledges that you should use in order to approach these narratives that have come up about the family in the time of the pandemic. So now just let's look at the history part. I mean, that is my passion. So if you look at the history part, the family ideals that we hold dear now, which we consider to be natural and normal and eternal now, are actually only around a century or so old. Maybe a century and a half old maximum. And these ideals have been reinforced constantly by cultural labor of modernity since around 120 years. It is based, this family ideal is based on a certain division of the world between the public and the domestic, and which is projected on the binary gender. That is, the public is identified with men and the domestic is identified with women. Now, in the family as an institution is placed within the domestic domain, and it was assigned the tasks of social reproduction and generational procreation. Both of these dharmas of the family are important. So there is generational procreation, so The family is expected to be the site of reproducing the next generation in a physical sense, in a corporeal sense. So giving birth to children in this society happens within families. It's supposed to be happening within families. And the other thing, dharma of the family is the social reproduction of social values. So the so-called family values, so-called social values are to be reproduced through the institution of family. And this as an institution, family is also linked in very precise terms to other institutions of socialization, such as the community and the pedagogy, that is schools and so on. Now, within the family, of course, the family in the 20th century was more or less imagined as exclusively heterosexual. Man and woman ideally were to be bound together in an equal relationship of sexual complementarity. So sexual complementarity means that men have a certain essential nature which allows them to do certain kinds of things. Similarly, women are supposed to have some kind of an essential nature which make them oriented towards certain kind of activities. And these activities and orientations complete each other. So that is what is called sexual complementarity. Now, this sexual complementarity was something that was imagined as fundamental to the ideal family. Nevertheless, it was accepted in the 20th century that because women were backward in modern education, the ideal of sexual complementarity in marriage would take a long time to realize. I mean, women had to be raised, this whole idea of uplift, social uplift. That word was very common in the 1950s and 40s and 50s. So women had to be uplifted from, their darkness or backwardness or whatever, educated, empowered, and made equal to men. And once that process was complete, then the ideal family would start running on the fuel of sexual complementarity. That was a promise that modernity made to Malayalis. Now, however, and that is why, for example, the sexual complementarity is interesting because women are supposed to be by nature essentially oriented towards domestic labor. So the whole idea of domestic labor was bound so tightly to wifely duty, wifely essence, maternal duty and maternal essence. So it was agreed that no matter how hard the domestic worker would work, her labor would never be the equal of what a mother can do. Now, as you probably have guessed, this is the reason why domestic labor is never really remunerated well or in a fair way. Because the simple reason is because that kind of labor in our discourse of gender is assumed to be something that flows from an essential maternal love and care. And a domestic worker can never care for, say, for example, children the same way as a mother can. Now, anyway, this ideal, of course, was quite dominant, continues to be dominant in Kerala. It's constantly reinforced by our institutions, including the school, the community, religion, and even government to some extent. So, and obviously, the home was imagined to be a place of leisure for men because their productive labor was imagined as lying outside the home. For women, it was a place of work. It is the place of work. For children, it is essentially a place to grow up, to build their own selves. Now, children in this whole imagination are mainly the recipients of care, and they are the raw material given to the parents to develop into full human beings. So they are not accepted to be full human beings. They are treated as the raw material which the parents have to work upon constantly in order to produce a human being of course, working closely with other institutions of socialization, such as schools. So the child is a care receiver, but essentially the most powerless person in the family. So I told you, a working class families very often are led by women, and they are usually the sole breadwinner.
Hello.
And those women have actually lost their families, their incomes. Informal sector women, for example, in a very underprivileged area in Trivandrum where I have done field work, a great number of women make a living out of cooking for local bakeries and hotels, like making food, appam, for example, making appams and sending it to the local bakery. Now, given that the shops have all been closed for a long time, they have lost their income. Women who used to be domestic workers, who had to go up to travel, these are women who live in slums. So the problem with our culture is that the moment you hear that your domestic help is coming from a slum area, you don't want them. So they have to travel for a long time. They have to conceal where they come from. So they work in places that are like 5 or 6 kilometers far away from them. They have to take a bus. The fact that there is no public transport means that all these women have lost their income. And they are now just surviving on whatever the government has given them and whatever they can borrow. So it is a terrible situation. You cannot imagine. In the families that I have worked with are in such a state. They are eating 2 meals a day. I mean, they have scaled down to eating 2 meals a day. So 1 meal at 12 o'clock and 1 meal at noon and 1 meal at around 8 o'clock in the evening. There are women who, when you take them food, they say, don't give us because we'll get used to eating that. Now, this is a situation that used to exist in Kerala in the 1960s. It is terrifying. And this is affecting mostly women. In families, all kinds of, inequalities of food distribution. The fact that the distribution of food was skewed against women at one time. That's coming back. It was all right. Continued to be skewed in other ways, but basic goods were made available to all. Now we are seeing a return, it appears, to a situation where men are given better food and women eat whatever is left behind. So it's a terrible scene for the poor, quite different from whatever we know of among the middle class and the better off. So now let me conclude by saying that what we're probably seeing, as a rise in domestic violence is actually a condensation of patriarchy. In fact, what we're seeing as both the rise in domestic violence as well as the rise of benevolent men in the home, men who are interested in cooking, men who are writing about being in the kitchen, men who are playing with children, and so on, so on. Both these phenomena are actually manifestation of condensations of patriarchy in a pandemic situation. Patriarchy, benevolent patriarchy can also be benevolent. So that's why some of these narratives sound like, some conqueror landing upon foreign shores and being fascinated by those places. So in some ways, both these are manifestations of a condensation of patriarchy enabled by the pandemic situations. And these both strands of the discourse on family life, just like that. Number two, I hope, again, another important issue, I hope that deliberations of today and tomorrow will take seriously, relate to the differences between families. I mean, rich families, poor families, small families, large families, and so on. These differences are very important. And the experience of women and children in these may be very different. And thirdly, I do hope that you will help to establish a more just interpretation of gender justice That is an interpretation of gender justice which will not reduce it to heteronormative terms. I'll stop there and take questions.
Meanwhile, ma'am, shall I ask you some doubts?
Yes. Yeah,
ma'am, you were talking about structural worthlessness. Do you feel that education, literacy level in Kerala is a bit high when compared to other states?
Yes.
Do you find that the rate of the structural barriers have been reduced by the educational system which is in progress in Kerala?
You know, unfortunately, education in Kerala is not designed in a way to break these structural barriers. You know, for that you need critical education, a critical education that will empower the woman to see herself as an equal and refuse and feel confident enough to refuse something like dowry. Now that is not the kind of education you receive. In fact, what you receive is the kind of education that indoctrinates you in a way that you would think that your whole aim in life is to contribute to the dowry amount. That is, you must get a job so that the parents will be asked less dowry, and you will offer a lifelong dowry to the husband by paying, bringing your salary home every day, every month. So that's the best, very often, our education will allow you to go.
So what are your solutions for the same, ma'am?
Can I complete? But
Okay.
The idea of structural worthlessness is a little different. This idea of structural worthlessness means that you may yourself be, a valuable person. You may have a job. You may have, you may have high degree of self-worth. Your parents may love you. You are not worthless at home. Your siblings and your parents may love you. The structure will deem you worthless. That is, despite all this, when it comes to marriage, you cannot be married without dowry. That's where you become structurally. Whereas your brother may not be loved. Your brother may be a pest. Your brother may be a great drain on family resources. He may be not loved. He may be useless. But he is not structurally worthless. Why? Because he will bring money. The most worthless fellow in Kerala will still get 1.5 lakh rupees as dowry. Even the useless fellows will get. So which means that the useless fellow is not structurally worthless. Whereas you, who maybe you become a top level scientist in NASA or something, but you still have to be, you find dowry for your marriage. So that is, unless the woman becomes confident enough to break that, to say that, fine, I don't want to be part of your structure. I don't want to be part of a structure in which I'm worthless. That kind of insight should come through education, right? But that is not what our education in Kerala. I've seen a huge difference between girls who go outside Kerala, study in the academic metropolises, and those who are in Kerala. I'm not saying everyone who goes outside Kerala gain all these great insights, etc. But again, I've seen a huge difference between girls in science education and girls in social science and arts, the liberal arts. So those who get a liberal education are more likely to challenge the system than those who get a science education, because somehow, the whole thrust of science education is not technology rather than science. Science would force you, if you took science seriously, it would force you to question all these givens. But then we understand science as essentially technology. So.
Okay, ma'am, there's a question in the chat box.
Yes.
The general notion that Kerala women are much empowered. In this crisis, how well are Kerala women coping with the crisis compared to the rest of the country?
I think we need a lot more research on this, particularly on how working class women are coping. As I told you, in the small community that I have been working with, I've seen women tighten their belts in scary ways that are scary. They don't want to, for example, in the sense that the only people who suffer and who really are themselves. Women have been running from pillar to post looking for television sets and phones to make sure that their children's education continues unimpaired. And in order to do that, they're often cutting down on meals, on food, making sure that they have a decent food that is available, refusing to let them go of their education, and then tightening the belts on themselves. Now, this is very much in tandem with the whole idea of the enlightened Kerala model woman who will make sure that the child stays in school no matter what. Also makes sure that the child's health is protected no matter what. So in some ways, we are very much the Kerala model women. That is there. Also, if you look at public caregiving, Kudumbashree is full of the poorer and lower middle class women in Kerala. They are doing a great job, no doubt. Now, what implication all this has for gender justice is $1 million question. Women are clearly protecting their families. Women are clearly protecting this Kerala society in general, by working in the Kudumbashree and so on. But what are they getting in return? That is really the $1 million question.
There's yet another question, ma'am. What are the advantages that women encounter during the COVID-19 crisis?
Well, I don't think women have any advantage. Women's labor, what I've been trying to say is that women's labor has gone up manifold. Whether in the working class family or in the middle class family, women are working much more. Now, the advantage, if there is to be an advantage, it should come from concrete government action, not just on domestic violence. The government, for example, in Kerala, needs to acknowledge that public caregiving by Kudumbashree is no longer something that can be unpaid and unrecognized. It cannot be taken for granted. Because if this is going to be the century of pandemics, then we will need a permanent public caregiving force. We will need that permanently. I mean, a force that can be called up at any moment in the face of a new pandemic. So such women, the women who work in that force, and in Kerala, very large number of poor and low middle class women are active in the Kudumbashree. Those women need to be trained and acknowledged and also remunerated. Let's not forget the remuneration part. Remunerated and made into the central backbone of our public caregiving system. Now that would be an advantage. But that is for the government to do, and that is for people like us to put pressure on the government to do. Now the problem is we don't do that. And that is why such situations as the one I mentioned in Trivandrum City. Can you imagine what happened? That is, the Trivandrum City Corporation was trying to set up a COVID care center in the city stadiums. And they were looking for cleaning staff. The Kudumbashree women were terrified, naturally, because they would be stigmatized even in their homes and surrounding areas. So they were very reluctant. And you know what the government did? They got the Kudumbashree's gender counseling service. Gender counseling service to sit down and persuade those women to join this force. I mean, men were offered better salaries. Men were offered better pay. Women were made to sit through counseling. Just look at the difference. So unless you pay those women properly, how do the families survive? How do they survive? How do they feel, that what happens to a sense of self-worth? So the advantage has to be created, and that creation must be through pressure on the government put by people like you and me.
The next question posed is, do you think equal right to property to women will do away with the menace of dowry?
Yeah, no, this is an old debate. We all know that, as long as women's property is understood to be basically a dowry endowment, there is going to be no use. Even if you give women equal rights in property, and of course in the Hindu law, etc., much change has happened. Now, even if you give that, if you understand this as dowry endowment, and it will be given to women only after they get married. That is a practice now. That women get access to even gold, you know. I mean, gold is universally accepted as women's Stri Dhanam in the literal sense that jewelry, even now, in order to sell the jewelry, etc., the husband's family has to take the woman's consent. You know, any decent family will do that. It's only completely indecent families that will take the woman's jewelry away. So even that is made available to the woman only after she gets married. Now this takes away, imagine what happens is when this happens, the woman does not get any opportunity. Now, suppose a woman wants to advance in higher education. In my own case, I know, if I was able to study in JNU for 2 years of my life, that was only because I had access to my gold. I was able to sell my gold so that, because my family was really not too keen on me studying anywhere outside Kerala. I had to sell my gold to go. Now, what happens to a woman if I did not have that access to gold? What would have happened? I would have stayed here, and I don't know what would have happened to me. Those 2 years in a university outside Kerala strengthened me as a scholar. You know, taught me how to be a scholar. Now, that is not something I would have gained from here. So, equal property rights alone is an important step, no doubt, but that alone cannot do away with dowry. To do it, to get out of dowry, you have to just refuse. You have to just refuse caste, because you see, in Kerala, dowry marriage has a direct relationship to endogamy. Why do certain men of certain community, I mean, men get so much dowry? Because they are eligible. And what are the grounds of their eligibility? Also their caste identity. They belong to the same caste identity as you. So the pool of grooms is strictly limited because of caste. If you get out of caste, then dowry again will not go away, but it will be reduced. And finally, the only real solution is to just refuse to marry a man who asks you. I mean, it's a simple matter of self-respect. If you respect yourself, you cannot pay somebody to marry you. Finish.
There's another question for you, ma'am. Violence to women has increased during lockdown. What could we do to overcome such a situation?
Well, there are, there are solutions. Until now, the solutions posed have all come from the state. So the Chief Minister has actually issued a public statement saying that men who indulge in domestic violence and make women work, who kind of deliberately increase women's workloads, will be punished. There have been some efforts to set up some helplines, etc., for women to use. But I think civil society solutions are equally important. That is, instead of expecting the state to do everything, I think those of us in the civil society must keep a watch around our own neighborhoods. So there has to be some kind of a consciousness raising exercise in civil society, by which all of us, I mean, you say that the best security, what is security? Security is not about the state protecting you. Security is about you protecting yourself and your neighbors. All of us protecting each other. That is security. So security from domestic violence only comes when we move on to a culture in which we protect each other. We take the responsibility for protecting each other. So when you take the responsibility of protecting your sister, your neighbor from domestic violence, then there is real security. Otherwise, the state, how much can the police do? Even if, assuming the Kerala police is notorious for the way it handles domestic violence, but assuming that there's 100% responsive police force, how much can they do in a time of pandemic? How much can they run around? Ultimately, the solution lies in you and I becoming each other's protector.
There's a question, ma'am. How far the present society influenced the development of women in Kerala? Do you think that women are less privileged in this modern society where we claim gender justice?
That's a huge question. I'm sorry. I mean, I don't think I'll be able to answer it, even if I lecture to you for 5 whole days, because it's too general a question. I mean, if you ask me a very general question, it'll be very difficult. I mean, I could ask you how far the present society influenced the development of women in Kerala. I can ask you the same question. I mean, can you imagine any society where the situation of women is not influenced by society? By definition, women are part of society. So whatever is present in society will influence women, right? State of society has a direct bearing on the state of women. Why? Because women are part of that society, right? So that's too general a question, Anju. You should ask me a little more focused, closer and more focused.
Okay, ma'am. Do you think that there will be change in social relations in Kerala during these days of pandemic?
You know, there is change. All change is perennial. You know, there is no such thing as a stable society. All societies are constantly in the throes of change. That is an indisputable fact. Not just our society, but any society anywhere in the world. So, in such a situation, but then if you're going to ask me if the pandemic will bring up any special change, of course, we are already seeing it, right? We are seeing that when our actual spaces, our real spaces, our actual spaces or offline spaces become dangerous, become actually quite pose all kinds of threats to our physical existence, and we are taking more and more to online spaces. And that will definitely affect the way we think about the world. For example, now for emotional sustenance, for example, a lot of families are now relying on pets, on animals, pets. Now, a lot of families are now saying that pets in the family are very important, animals. So the idea of the family as including necessarily a non-human, a pet, might become more common. Or a family where, people have to have, what Donna Haraway calls a cyborg, since we all have become cyborgs, that is, we are all connected to technology. Our every daily lives are not only mediated by technology, technology is even part of our own bodies. Now, most of us, many of us have a cell phone is almost part of our body, and the cell phone has a tracker, as a COVID. The government is tracking you through an application in that phone. So, so that means we are cyborgs. We are not human anymore. That means we're not simply human. We are cyborgs. All of us are cyborgs. So once even a little children start becoming cyborgs, then the whole idea of family will change. But that will take time, not immediately.
Ma'am, there are a number of questions coming in. Can you just put it to you right now?
Yes, please do.
Okay, ma'am. What can we do to reduce this gender inequality?
Again, a huge question. Do not ask over general questions. Please ask more focused ones.
Okay, ma'am. Do you think that the freedom of speech against violence for women from middle and upper class is less when compared to women from poor families?
Yes, in a way, yes. In surveys, etc., I have noticed that it's far more difficult for upper class women and middle class women to talk about and admit to the presence of gender violence, domestic violence in their families than working class women. Because working class women find it easier to talk about domestic violence than that's something I've seen. Nevertheless, my experience over the past 20 years is that the reluctance of middle class women and upper class women to speak about domestic violence is reducing. It is not increasing.
Ma'am, finally, one more question. Do you believe the digital platform will strengthen the women's social support and bring more awareness and action for equal rights in Kerala specifically, or in India in general?
Yeah, digital spaces have definitely, have definitely many positive implications for women. As I told you, a lot of women who do not have the resources to move outside into the public or have a public life have a public life now through digital spaces. So if you look at now, just look at the number of women who write in Malayalam now, who write well in Malayalam. Many of them are not people who had any access to public life earlier. They entered public life through digital spaces, sometimes using pseudonyms, but effectively so. And now many of them are very important public presences. So obviously there is a lot in the digital spaces that hold prospects for women. But at the same time, these digital spaces are also, completely dominated by, patriarchal forces, which don't mind using violence against women at all. In fact, that threaten the forces of patriarchy are so threatened by these digital spaces and women occupying these digital spaces that we often find that the violence unleashed against women who are influential in these digital spaces is breathtakingly high.
Questions keep popping up. Shall I put one more question before you?
Yes, please. Yes.
Do you think that women in Kerala, in spite of the literacy, are being marginalized, specifically in case of working women? Still, they are burdened with home and official chores. Do we require a cultural shift to address this?
No, yeah, in this case, there's some very interesting research I've seen, and I myself have had thoughts on this, on why, women in Kerala, who are especially the highly educated and empowered women, take up extremely demeaning roles when it comes to their family lives and community lives. I pondered on this quite a lot during the Namajapa Koshayatras, where you found highly educated, empowered women taking unbelievably regressive positions on women's social roles. Now, one reason I can tell you is, women who have gained access to employment and higher education in Kerala, in a very large number of them are from upper caste backgrounds, and I would call them neo-Savarna, that is belonging to either the traditional Savarna communities or to the financially empowered sections of the Avarna. That's the neo-Savarna. Combining these two, you get the neo-Savarna. So the thing about neo-Savarna women is that they have a huge stake in caste power. So how is caste power maintained? Caste power is maintained by conforming to a certain acharam-bound family role and community role. And performing this acharam-bound community role is very important. As I told you, it undergirds their access to caste power. So when women consent to extremely demeaning responsibilities and burdensome responsibilities at home, they are in some ways consenting to this Savarna idea of, neo-Savarna idea of what it means to be a woman. It is the status of a secondary citizen who is bodily impure and who cannot really enter, who can never be equal in terms, within religion, because the religion says that women are less than men in some ways, or women's difference makes them in many ways impure. So women who continue to believe in that are doing so not because they are mentally somehow backward or unable to think. They are doing that because it allows them to cling on to caste power. So the education they get, the employment they get, the salaries they get, these are the benefits they have reaped from the Kerala model development that they are keeping. That is important for them. But they also want to keep the caste power. They want both. So that is why many women cling on to both. They are highly employed, engineers in KCB, who like minting money, I tell you, or engineers and doctors, techno park, business women, you name it. But they still would say the most regressive kinds of things, saying that the woman's fundamental duty is to in the home and taking care of children, and so on. There are many of these women are divorcees, who are remarried, and some of the leaders of that Namajapa Koshayatra lived completely, women who live completely unconventional lives. But this would still talk, when it comes to talking, it's always the most conservative positions that they take. That's because they need that caste power. They are, into this Nair or whatever, Savarna, Hindu caste power. They need that. So they want both. They want both the fruits of development as well as, and they don't perceive any, they don't care for these contradictions. They are these are power hungry people. That's all I can say. They don't mind trampling on the rights that women have gained after centuries of struggle. They're enjoying those rights. They're free riders. They enjoy those rights, but they want to put other women down. They want to make sure that they want to stay above the downtrodden. They want to continue exploiting the poorer sections of the people and exploiting caste power. Therefore, they play on both sides. That's my answer to you.
Okay, ma'am. There's another question. Do you think religion is a basic factor for this gender inequality?
Religion, again, if you ask about religion, you should also ask about state, because all institutions in which you find it rests upon this heteronormative ideal, of binary gender. All such institutions are basic to patriarchy. So if the state is relying on an idea of man-woman, as the world has divided exclusively into man for public, woman for domestic, if that is the idea, then even that is contributing to patriarchy. All religions any religion that relies on that kind of a framework in an uncritical kind of way, that is also contributing to patriarchy. All this happens. The struggle is within these religions, not against them very often. Because they are large, you have to make change inside. Like we struggle within the state. We know that the state for a long time relied on this idea of men for public, women for domestic, right? Even now it continues to do so. But we don't say that, what we do is we struggle with the state. We struggle to make changes in the state. And of course, at revolutionary movements, you kind of, you keep putting critical pressure on the state so that it changes. Likewise, within religion, all over the world, the major world religions, if it is not happening in Hinduism, that's because of caste. But in whether it's Christianity, whether it's Islam, and whether it's Buddhism, in all these different religions, you have women who are struggling inside the religion to actually make a change. In Hinduism, it's difficult because of caste.
There's another question, very interesting, in fact. What is the role of mothers in perpetuating socialization of gender inequality in Kerala, regardless of the level of education and access to wealth or asset?
Yes, that's an interesting question, because you see, and I don't know why you said interesting. Like saying, what is the role of fathers in, I don't know why we never asked this question. What is the role of fathers in perpetuating socialization of gender inequality in Kerala? Why don't we ask that question ever? Now this is like, this is another way of paraphrasing this stupid idea that women are women's worst enemies. That's the whole thing. Now, that's an idiotic question, if you ask me. It's like saying, now, why? Because it is born out of bias, unbelievable bias. That is, you open the newspapers, every day you find all kinds of incidents of fathers murdering sons, sons murdering fathers, nephews murdering uncles, friends, men murdering each other, friends murdering each other, colleagues murdering each other. Totally. But you'll never ask, why are men's worst enemies? Do we ask that question ever? Do we? In many of the Dalit crimes, the crimes perpetrated against Dalits in India, it is men murdering men. But do we ask, are men's worst enemies? I leave you to think, Now, women, mothers, of course, are like any instrument of in family itself is an instrument of patriarchy. The mother who is supposed to be living, whose identity is inextricably bound with the family, who's supposed to be the guardian of family values, is forced in some ways to be the agent of patriarchy. So, of course, if you want to oppose patriarchy, you will have to fight with your mother. No other way. But you don't have to hate her, you know. You don't have to hate your parents. If you want to fight patriarchy, it's totally possible by just fighting it. Why do you want to hate the agents of patriarchy? I mean, they didn't create patriarchy, did they? They just became agents of it without them knowing even. So one can always fight, one can always refuse to abide by patriarchal violence, but at the same time, not hate the agents of patriarchy. And that's why I'm telling you that feminism is a form of spiritualism. Feminism, if you practice feminism, it is a spiritual practice. It requires a great deal of spiritual strength, because feminism does not let you hate anybody. Feminism makes you hate power, not even hate power. Feminism insists that you resist patriarchal power, but you don't hate the agents of patriarchy.
So there's another question, ma'am. Our empowered society is still thinking, if women could have access to their own bank accounts, what is your take on this issue?
Women do have, now with Kudumashri, you know that they all have bank accounts. So I don't...
Oh, okay, ma'am. There's another question. Does informal banking and self-help groups for women build up empowerment and local economy in tribal settings in India?
No, it's difficult because you see, the self-help group as well as microcredit. You know what? It's the whole idea of the self-help group is a liberal idea. You know, it's built on the idea that the collective interest is a sum total of the interests of the members of the group. That is, if you have 20 members in a Kudumashri group, each of these women represent one family each. So each of these women represent the interests of that family. So collective interests can be calculated by adding up the sum total of the individual interests of members of the group. Now that is a liberal idea, that there is no such thing as collective interest existing outside the sum total of individual interests. Now this is not an idea that is shared by any tribal community. In tribal communities, the collective interest is not the sum total of the interests of individual tribal families or persons or whatever. The collective interest is like the forest, you know, just like a forest cannot be the sum total of the trees in the forest. The collective interest for a tribal community just cannot, it's far beyond the simple sum of total of interest of the numbers present in the group. Now, because the idea of microcredit cannot understand the sense of collective, it is bound to fail with ecosystem people, not just tribal people, but any ecosystem people, including the coastal communities and so on.
So we come to the end of the session. We are carrying us the message which you have given us, in fact, to recognize and respect the worth within ourselves as women and to be assertive. Thank you for the thought-provoking words, ma'am. On behalf of the Women's Studies Center, Cochin University of Science and Technology, I express my sincere gratitude towards you for being the keynote speaker and giving us a mind-blowing lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I hope you have 2 wonderful days of deliberation, and all my best wishes.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.